Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Our Small Footprint. My name is Nissa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. The current video series that I'm doing is one that I do each month. We do our supply runs, grocery runs every 6 weeks, and then I do daily videos for however long I take afterwards to show how we use the items that we buy, how we preserve them, store them, how we cook them and make them last for the 8 of us over the 6-week period. So today's video, I've gone into some sourdough in depth because I've had some questions. We also did more tomatoes, and we processed one of the pork roasts, diced for mince, smoked some as a roast, and cooked the rind over potatoes to eat with meal as well. So enjoy watching, and as always, any questions in the comments and I will endeavour to answer, and I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks, guys. So the morning started off with more tomatoes. I know, shock horror. So I was doing the normal that I had been doing with the tomatoes, cutting them in half and taking out that little bit of core and placing them in the trays. I did 2 trays full of tomatoes because Daryl was using some trays as well. So you can see him in the background, and what he's doing is removing the rind off one of the rolled pork roasts that we buy from Costco. These are $6.99 a kilo. They're a really good buy. We use them for a lot of different things. So what he's doing is removing all the rind off them and then dicing the leftover pork into pieces that we will marinate, and then I can use that for mincing up for a variety of things, whether I make it into sausages or I use it in frittatas or it goes on pizza toppings. Any of those things is what we use it for. Very versatile, and it stretches that meat a long way. So we fill the trays with potatoes. So I just cut these little red potatoes. These ones are from Costco as well. I tend to buy a couple of bags of these every month because this is a perfect use for them. So we cut the potatoes in half and place them in the cast iron trays, and then we just lay the rind over the top. So we just slice the rind into pieces and put it over the top of the potatoes to be cooked. And then that way the lard renders off the rind into the potatoes, and it also gives us the crispy rind. We generally don't eat all the rind. A lot of it goes as treats to the dogs. We eat some hot, and then whatever's left goes to the dogs. We also covered a piece of the pork in a rub for the smoker. So we cut about 1/3 off the roast to use for that, which gives us 1 meal and a bit of leftovers. So we covered that in a seasoned rub. I normally would put mustard on first and then the rub, but I didn't have any mustard made and the kitchen was already full, and so we didn't. The rub is my normal, a mix of smoked paprika, salt, pepper, garlic powder, onion powder, mustard powder, that sort of a thing. And then we just coat the entire outside of the roast with that rub. Once it's covered, we put it into the smoker. So I insert a probe into the roast while it's in the smoker, and then I can use that to assess the internal temperature of it, so I don't have to open and close the smoker or anything like that, which works really well. And it has a Bluetooth function if I want to use it and check it from my phone. So we set the smoker at around about the 250 Fahrenheit mark. It's got that on the dial. I find that easiest to use, but we're going to cook it to 73 to 76 Celsius internal. We use wood chunks from our trees, so we have a couple of trees that smell and taste good when you smoke, a couple that don't. So these are from the red gums that are a good one to use, and we have a box of these little pieces. Once the rind is over the potatoes, then we spray the rind with some oil. I had a couple of questions about this sprayer. This is just a Decor brand sprayer. It's plastic, but I have bought some of the glass and stainless steel ones off eBay and various other places, and you have to pump them, and I don't find they just don't work as well. This plastic one works perfectly. So long as I use it for as long as I can, then I'm okay with that. So I sprinkle it generously with some fine salt as well. Both trays of the potato with the rind go into the wood stove. The top, you do have to rotate the trays in this because being on that rack, the top one cooks a little faster because of the radiated heat from the top of the oven as well. So you have to swap them over so the top one doesn't burn before the bottom one is cooked. Once it's all cooked, we stick it on a rack, so we just pull it all out of the pan within sort of 5 minutes of pulling it out and put it all on that rack, and then that way it's not soaking up any of the excess lard. It drips down underneath, and we collect that lard to put into a jar to use for cooking purposes over the next however long that particular batch lasts. Of course, we always have the lard that we've already rendered, which I think I've forgotten to share that video yet. I need to do that. The pork is ready, the roast is ready when it reaches an internal of about 73 to 76 Celsius for a slicing pork. If I was pulling it, it would need to go up to about 99, but I would have had to have put it in a tray with some liquid and stuff because it would be too lean to use as a pulled pork as is without adding some moisture in there. So once it is at the relevant temperature, then I pull it out and I put it in a tray and I wrap it with foil to rest for a while. It's whatever time it was today, we're eating it for dinner, so it rested until we had it for dinner. It was still warm when we had it at dinner time, and then just put it aside. This is what it looked like when we were slicing it for dinner. I like to slice them nice and thin because it goes further, but it slices really easy. It's really tender. It doesn't fall apart, which is on purpose. That's why we only cooked it to that temperature. It does work as slices, but it works on sandwiches. It works as hot meat with vegetables for dinner. It works for a variety of things. We served it tonight for dinner with sautéed mixed vegetables. So we had cauliflower and broccoli and things like that left in the fridge that we were using, so I just cut them up and sautéed them in a little bit of ghee, and then had it with the pork and some of the potatoes from the trays as well. We do eat the potatoes when they're hot as like a lunch, but we try and keep some aside to have with dinner as well, so we had some of them as well. The next thing I had to do was to make some sourdough for the next day, because we intend to have soup tomorrow or the day after, whenever it is. We needed bread for it. So I make a really basic round loaf. I make a lot of fancier things, like, you've seen me make bagels and baguettes and all that sort of stuff, but the basic round loaf is one of my favorites, and it works perfectly with soup and things like that. We just tend to go through it a little bit faster than if I make something individual like bagels or English muffins or baguettes. They tend to last a little bit longer because they're portioned out, whereas these loaves tend to get eaten quicker. So what I do when I make my dough is I do it as an overnight dough. I start it the night before, and I fill all my bowls. So I use my scales and I fill all my bowls as needed with what I'm using. So I have 2 bowls here for dough and then my starter. So once I've used the starter, I fill and feed my starter as well, which I'm filling here with 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water to go aside. And then I mix the dough. So my dough is it depends on the weather a little bit. So at the moment we don't have a fire inside because it's not cold enough, but it is getting down to 10 or 15 degrees inside at night still. So I'm using 75 grams of starter, which is just a little bit more than when it's hot. I use around about 350 grams of water, 9 grams of salt, and 500 grams of bread flour. That seems to work for the temperature right at the moment. You just mix it into a shaggy dough. You just need to make sure that there's no chunks of dried flour in the bowl or in the dough that initially. You want it all mixed enough to hydrate. You can buy a Danish dough whisk, and it helps a lot in this mix. It's not quite as messy and it works really well. I did have one, but it broke and I haven't replaced it as yet. I like to use my hands, but it does make a mess, and you do have to be careful if you use your hands and you live somewhere where your water is going to a septic or it has narrow pipes and things like that. When you wash your hands, you can have problems with clogging up of your drains with the sourdough going into the drain. I don't have that problem because we've got large rural piping on our sinks, but it can be an issue. So some people use gloves because that way when it dries on the gloves, you can just shake the dried dough off, or you just use a wooden spoon. Now the best practice once you've whisked it all together, you need to cover it and leave and put it aside. So I use whatever I have. Cling wrap, beeswax wraps, damp tea towels, whatever I have at the time, and cover the dough. I would like to get some nice containers with lids to use for this, but I want them round, so I haven't got there yet. I might need to buy myself some Pyrex or something. The best practice for the dough is that you want to stretch and fold, so you want to work the dough 4 times before you let it sit. So every 30 minutes for 2 hours before it sits for overnight. I never manage to do that. I try and do at least one stretch and fold about half an hour after I've mixed the dough. Sometimes I don't even manage that. The bread definitely turns out better if I at least do the one stretch and fold, but even if I've done none, it's still well and truly edible. So all you're trying to do is you're trying to bring the sides into the middle. So when you stretch and fold, when you open the dough at that first half hour point, it still looks rough, shaggy, and not very emulsified on the top. You will notice when you do that very first stretch and fold that the dough looks elastic. It looks nice and smooth. Any last bits of flour are joined in, and it just looks really nice. So you want to just grab the edges of the bowl, bring them in the middle, and you just keep on turning and keep on doing that as much as you need to for it to feel nice. You can't really overdo it. You can't really underdo it either. This sort of a loaf is really forgiving. Now, obviously, the better you are at it, the more you do it, things like that, you're going to get more Instagram worthy loaves. But all the loaves are edible so long as you cook them and cook them to an internal temperature. So all the other faffing about is up to you as to how much your routine will allow for it. So most of the time I do one stretch and fold, and then it comes inside and sits on the side of the sideboard near the incubators for the night, and then I will assess it in the morning as to what the temperature has been like, as to whether it needs to be handled first thing in the morning or not. In summer, I have to do it at like 6:30 in the morning, or it will overproof. At the moment, I think 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning I can still drag it out to. So in the morning, so I'm going on to the next day here so that I can show this whole process. In the morning, you have to shape the dough. So all I do is I wet the mat lightly, the dough mat lightly. You can use flour. I prefer using just a little bit of moisture. I find it easier. Then you can see that the dough has some bubbles on the surface, and it's around about 1.5 times the size it was when you put it aside in the evening. You pull it out onto the mat, and you want to be confident with it, but gentle. So you want to confidently scrape it out onto the mat, but you don't want to put too much pressure on the dough and degas it. Once you've got it on the mat, all you do is you bring all the edges into the middle, just like you did when it was in the bowl, so that all the edges are in the middle, and then you flip it over onto that side, and you sort of roll it and drag it on your mat. So all you're trying to do is bring all the edges into the middle on the bottom, and you can see it happening. You can see that the top of it gets tauter, and it creates a bit of a skin on the top, and it's dragging that skin into the middle on the bottom and creating much like a balloon structure on the outside. So the more you stretch it, the tighter that goes. You can't really... I would say that you can go too far in that you can be a little too rough with it, but if you're nice and gentle and you're doing it, I've never had one tear or anything like that, but you just want to get a nice firm surface on the top. Once you've got that firm surface on the top, then you're going to place it into your container. So for me, the container that I use, so a lot of people use Bannetons. Bannetons are made from wood fibres, and for me they go mouldy. So we have an outdoor kitchen, we have humid weather, and they don't last. No matter what I do with them, I cannot store them appropriately to keep them clean. So what I use is stainless steel colanders. These were bought from Kmart, I believe, and they're the perfect size for what I cook in. They make a nice round. So all I do is I have stainless steel colanders, and then I line them with clean tea towels, and then I sprinkle semolina over the tea towel. Once you've got your dough into that nice tight ball, you're going to place it with the tight side down into the colander, and you're just going to pinch together the tops of the dough. Nothing significant, you just want to bring it together a little bit at the top. I normally then put a bit more semolina over the bottom of the dough and down the edges so that your tea towel isn't going to stick, and then repeat. So I've got 2 loaves, I had to do it twice. Once you've got them in there, you just bring the tea towel back over the top. So these are going to go into the fridge. So the reason you want it in this instead of a bowl is that you want the dough to breathe while it's in the fridge. The idea is that you're going to retard the proofing, so it's not going to overproof because it's in the fridge, but we only took it to 1.5 times size, so it's still got a little bit of movement that it can make in the fridge. Having the tea towel in the colander or having it in a Banneton means that the dough is breathing, and what it's doing is it's creating a skin on the outside of the dough, but slowly, not like if it was completely exposed out in the daylight. So it's creating a little bit of a skin to help with that lift of the dough while it's in the fridge. You want to keep it in the fridge for like a minimum of 4 to 6 hours, but you can keep it in there for up to 72. And depending on my cycle, I do regularly put it in the fridge in the morning and not bake it until the next morning. It just depends on how my day is going. Once you've had that fridge retard and you've slowed down the fermentation, given it that bit of a skin, made it a little firmer and easier to handle, you're going to tip it out onto baking paper. So you just put a piece of baking paper underneath it, tip the tray, and then it's on the baking paper. You need to score the dough. If you don't score the dough, it will just pop however it wants, which is unattractive, but also it makes for a less uniform dough, a less uniform loaf, which is harder to slice, but it also could pop from the bottom. It's better to score your dough. So I just do a simple cross on my rounds. I find that that's a really simple way of doing it, and it looks nice when it's done and it works well. So when you're scoring it, I just use a razor blade. It's just a loose razor blade. You want to do it, you don't want to hesitate. You want to do it nice and firm, and you don't want it to drag down the dough. You want it to cut. You definitely want it to slice that dough, not drag it, because it just won't work as well. So I cook these in the wood stove, and so what I use to cook them in so that I can fit 2 loaves in at a time is that I use a enamel billy cans. You can use Dutch ovens, you could use any sort of a dish with a lid. You can even do it open in the oven. It's just going to change the shape of how it bakes. If you do it on a flat tray and your dough doesn't have a great deal of tension, then it's going to flatten out a little bit. It doesn't mean it's not going to be edible though. It's just going to look a bit different. So I use these billy cans, which are a great size for me, and they fit these colander loaves in really well. So the billy cans work really well for the wood stove. So all I do is I place them in the billy cans and I put them into a cold oven, or one that's just been turned on, so it's only warmish, so we've just started the fire or whatever. I bake them for about 25 to 30 minutes with the lid on, and then about 20 to 25 minutes with the lid off. Now you can check the internal temperature of your loaf, and about 200 degrees is cooked for a sourdough loaf. So if you're hesitant and you're not sure, you can check that and make sure, but I generally just do it by eye. I have been known to burn my loaves because I walk away and forget, so I tend to overcook rather than undercook. And you can cut it while it's hot, and of course I do all the time, but if you cut it while it's hot, the texture inside will change. The texture of the bread will go a little bit gummy and a little bit dense because of the humidity change when you're slicing them when they're hot and the steam. So if you cool them, they will slice nicer, and they will hold their texture a little bit better, be a little bit less wet. So we sliced this a couple of hours after it was made because we used it for dinner with soup. So I hope that has helped and hasn't been too much of rambling. I have had some questions about sourdough and things like that, and I'm trying to cover bits and pieces as I go along. Let me know in the comments if there's further questions or anything else, but hopefully I've covered that without being too verbose, but with being verbose enough that it makes sense. Thanks guys for joining me again.